All right, everybody. I wanted to go over the two psychological theories this week in greater detail than we'll be able to do in the webinar tomorrow. I'm going to kind of highlight the features of two of the schools of thought, but for people who like to take good notes and for those of you that use these really well to do your schools of thought papers, then I want to go over it nice and slow so that you can have it to pause and go back and do all that good stuff. So if you have your school of thought paper, get it out. If you don't have your school of thought paper, pause this right now, go back into Schoology, into psychology, into Unit 2, into Week 1, and grab that school of thought. Go into the psychoanalysis school of thought, click into there, and we're not doing psychoanalysis today, but we're doing the school of thought for humanist and behaviorist this week. So this week we're going to have two things due: the behaviorist school of thought and the humanistic school of thought. Okay? And so once you have them open on your computer and ready to go, then press play again, and we'll get started. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the historical background of behaviorism. And behaviorists are called the second wave of psychology because they came right after the psychoanalysis movement, the psychodynamic movement, right? So they are a reaction to that. And you'll see they're kind of the opposite of a psychoanalyst. And they didn't like this new theory of psychology called psychoanalysis because none of the theories could be tested, or at least not tested very well. How do you test the unconscious is a question they always asked. How do you test the preconscious? How do you test the successful negotiation of the psychosexual stages? That there are a lot of things in psychoanalysis that don't hold up to scientific scrutiny, which is why psychoanalysis these days isn't practiced as much or as widely as behaviorism is, for instance. Because behaviorism is still used all the time, especially in school settings, like where I work, and with kids. Parents use behaviorism all the time. So beginning in the 1920s, behaviorism kind of developed concurrently, which means that it branched off from psychoanalysis, and they're kind of, so it branched off, and then they're developing together concurrently at the same time. And we're definitely competitors. And this kind of psychology focuses, especially in the beginning, focused a whole lot on experimental psychology. So you remember that from the first webinar where we talked about what is psychology. There's two kinds of psychology, right? There's applied psychology, which is where you take a theory and you apply it to a real situation or person. And then there's experimental psychology, which is where you do research and you find out and test new theories. And this was, especially at the beginning, very focused on the scientific method and testing new theories and on experiments. Some very famous experiments, really. So in the first part I want to talk about, and this is stuff you want to write down, of course, for your school of thought. We had a little bit about the history there. The second part is about human nature, right? And the behaviorist school of thought believes a couple of key points, right? One of which is that people are products of two things, their genes and their environment. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard the story about nature versus nurture, and what percentage is nature and what percentage is nurture. Nature would be genes, right? Things you inherit from your parents, aspects and traits you inherit from your parents. And then nurture would be your environment, aspects of your behavior that is learned through interaction with your environment, right? So it's shaped through two things, conditioning and reinforcement, according to a behaviorist. And we're going to talk about the definitions of conditioning and reinforcement here in a little bit. But behavior is learned through interacting with the environment, and it's also, people are also a product of the genetic predisposition of their parents, right? So you can be carriers for diseases, for instance, right? but not have them, or you could actually have them if your parents have them, right? Or you could be more susceptible to them if your parents have them. And a behaviorist is going to say the same thing about behavior. You know, there are reasons why you act like your parents. Some of it is because of genetic things passed down to you. You know, you and your dad may both be prone to anger because of genes, right? They also said that you and your dad could also be prone to anger because of how your dad was raised by your grandparents and about how you were raised by your dad. You know, similar environments equals similar outcomes, they would say. Now, modern behaviorism explains that not just that people are products of the environment or like, you know, the environment acts on them, but that you actually act on your environment, right? Humans do this all the time, right? I acted on my environment today, right? Because I went into the conference room to have quiet. And I made sure that outside there is, you know, people are talking and, you know, discussing other educational topics, not psychology. So I wanted a quiet place to do my recording, right? So I come in here and I've affected my environment, right? I set up the room the way I wanted it. I made it was the right temperature. I have a drink here in case I run out of things to, you know, my mouth gets dry and stuff, right? So I set up my environment the way I like it, just like you do in your room at your house. Um, Behaviorists believed a couple things about people being healthy too, right? They believe that your problems come from conditioning, and that leads to maladaptive, bad behavior, right? Behavior that doesn't work well in polite society. And we'll talk about the difference between classical and operant conditioning in a second, so you don't have to know the definition yet, but that's where they believe problems came from, is you and your environment interacting and you being reinforced um, with what your environmental stimuli are. And then wellness, you know, a person who is well would be someone who has no maladaptive behaviors, right? Someone who doesn't have any behavior that causes people to be like, what the heck is he doing? Or, man, that guy's weird. Or, man, he's freaking out, you know? So that would be wellness, according to a behaviorist. So your behavior is socially acceptable. Now think back to the psychoanalysts, right? And you know, they believe that wellness came from successfully negotiating those psychosexual stages. But here, for the behaviorists, they're talking about behavior, right? And that's the only thing they care about. They don't care um, um, about the thoughts that go along with behavior. They don't care about the emotions that go along with behavior. They're primarily concerned with the behavior itself. And they would say that a well person is someone who has no maladaptive behaviors. So here are some famous behaviorists. Some of you have done research on them already, or on one of these guys already. Um, Ivan Pavlov, many people know because he had a very famous experiment with dogs and salivation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. He was Russian, and he actually began as a physiologist, as a doctor, you know, of medical anatomy. And eventually he moved toward behaviorism and coming up with some psychological theories through his experiments. And he won the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1904 for his famous experiment with the dogs. B.F. Skinner is another behaviorist. He was a Harvard professor. And Pavlov is all about classical conditioning, and Skinner is all about operant conditioning. We'll talk about the differences here in a little bit. But B.F. Skinner is the man for operant conditioning. He's the picture for week 2, the guy in front of all the mice that we have for week 2. Albert Bandura is also another behaviorist. We're getting, you know, from older to newer. So Albert Bandura is a Stanford professor. He's the president of American Psychological Association. He's the most frequently cited living psychologist, if you can believe that. He developed a theory called social learning, which is kind of based off of Skinner's work. And then there's Arnold Lazarus, who's a South American, and he is kind of a bridge person between the behaviorists and a theory that we're going to talk about next week called the cognitive theories. Cognitive theories are all about your thoughts. All about your thoughts. And so he kind of mixed behaviorism and cognitive theories together, but he's generally considered a behaviorist because most of his theory is grounded in behaviorism. So if you did if you did research on any of these guys, they're all very interesting. They've all led really interesting lives, and they all have pretty interesting theories too, I think. Okay, so let's talk about conditioning and reinforcement. If you remember nothing else about behaviorism theory, you need to understand conditioning and reinforcement. Okay, so when you think of behaviors, I want you to think of this, conditioning and reinforcement. This is an important caveat though, this first thing right here. Behaviors are based on events which precede behavior. So what that's saying is that you have a behavior because of something that happened before. I hope that makes sense to everybody. You have a behavior based off of something that happened before. Conditioning allows you to learn new behaviors through reacting to a stimulus or through reinforcement. So there are two ways that you can be conditioned. Just your basic instinctual reaction. You know, you touch a hot stove and it's hot, and you go, ah, hot, right? That's a reaction. That's a behavior, you know, and that was reacting to a stimulus, right? Touching a stove and going, ah, hot. The other way you could condition yourself, though, is through reinforcement, right? You could touch something hot and I could give you $1 million, right? Would you touch it again for another $1 million? Would you touch it again for another $1 million? Would you touch it again for another $1 million? Despite it being really hot, right? So I could reinforce that behavior of touching hot things all the time if I do it correctly. So I can reinforce behavior that's something that you would never do in reality, you know, that you would never do normally. You know, you're not going to just like put your hand on a hot stove and be like, ah, that feels great, you know. So you can reinforce things in order to get that behavior to continue, right? And reinforcement comes in two flavors: rewards and punishments. And the reinforcement thing, that's what makes the learning stick. So, you know, if you want the behavior to be repeated, you have to offer reinforcement. Dog owners know this. I guess pet owners in general probably know this, right? If you're a dog or a cat or any sort of animal that can be trained and reinforced, right? If you reward the animal for behavior you like, going out to get your paper, sitting down before eating food, shaking, speaking, rolling over, you know, all those sorts of things. You know, if you reward the animal for doing that, then the behavior is going to continue and become a lot more frequent, right? Parents do this to kids all the time, right? I'm sure parents did this to you when you were a kid, right? So as many times as they rewarded you for good behavior, right? That behavior continues. Now, if parents don't quite understand how this works, then what happens is that they can reward a person for, you know, doing a behavior that they don't really want to continue, and they can't figure out why it's continuing, but it's because they keep rewarding it. And rewards can come in all shapes and sizes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, let's talk about Pavlov and the first kind of conditioning to ever be theorized. It's called classical conditioning. It's classical because it was the first one, right? Operant will be the second one here. And Pavlov, like I said before, was working, you know, in the early 1900s. And I have a chart that'll kind of show this. So visual learners, give me a second to talk about it, and then we'll show the chart. Okay? But this is kind of complicated, which is why I wanted to kind of go over this slowly. So bear with me here, okay? When Pavlov is talking about classical conditioning, he's talking about four things, right? He's talking about stimulus and response, and there's two types of each thing, right? There's unconditional stimulus and a conditional stimulus, then an unconditioned response and a conditioned response. And what you're going to go from is an unconditioned stimulus to a conditioned response. We're going to come back to this when we talk about learning, and we're going to do a couple experiments around this because it's kind of fun. But let's talk about it in general terms first, okay? Unconditional stimulus is something that gets a natural response that you can't control. So it's like an instinctual response to something, right? Food makes you hungry, and it makes your mouth water. Or drool, you know, depending on who you are. An unconditioned response is like an automatic biological response to a stimulus, right? So once you're hungry, or once you start salivating, you know, you smell the food, that's a stimulus, and your response is your stomach growls or hurts, clenches up, and you're like, oh man, that food smells so good. Your mouth starts to water, right? That's an unconditioned response. The stimulus is the thing that is um, the cause, and then the response is the thing that you do in response to the cause. So you smell the food, that's the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response is hunger pangs, salivation, thinking, man, I really want to eat that right now. And you do this all the time, right? You walk past, some sort of restaurant, and you're hungry, and you're like, oh man, that smells so good. That's unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Now, you can be trained, though, to have a response to any kind of stimulus, and that's called conditioning. So a conditional stimulus is what used to be something neutral that eventually will become a stimulus. And you're gonna make it a stimulus by what psychologists call pairing, which means that every time that you smell the food, a bell rings, right? And if it happens every time, eventually you'll start to associate that bell with the smell of the food, right? And then I can start ringing the bell, and I can get a conditioned response, right? The conditioned response is what used to be an automatic biological response, the hunger pangs, the salivation. That's now tied to not just the smell of the food, but now it's tied to the bell, right? The conditional stimulus. So eventually, if I do this, every time you smell the food, I ring the bell. Every time you smell the food, I ring the bell. And I do this for a couple of weeks, then I can just ring the bell, and you'll automatically think food, and you'll start to salivate. You'll get the hunger pangs. You'll be like, man, I really want like a hamburger or something, whatever the smell was to begin with. I really want some mac and cheese. I really want something. And so over time, you can change what was an automatic response into something that I, as the stimulus controller, can control, right? So if I can control the stimulus, I can control your response. So here's a visual representation of what we just talked about, right? At first, you ring the bell, and this is Pavlov's experiment. He did it with dogs. You rang the bell, the dogs could care less. They're walking around like they don't even notice the bell, right? They're like, what's that sound? I don't know. Just going to continue on looking myself and, eating my food and walking around and, saying hi to other dogs. Then, during the conditioning period, though, every time the food is presented, he rings the bell. Food's presented, rings the bell. Food's presented, rings the bell. Food's presented, rings the bell. And the dog, every time, you smell the food, he has that automatic response, right, of salivation and of being hungry and being like, food! And then eventually, though, Pavlov could just ring the bell, and the dog would be like, food! Instead of thinking that, you needed to have the actual food there. Because the dog then learned that the bell is associated with the food. And so then he could just ring the bell and make the dog salivate whenever he wanted. Pretty awesome, right? You want to try that on your little brothers and sisters or cousins or something? That's not very ethical, so don't think that. Okay, so then after class, that's classical conditioning, right? Where you take a biological response and then you condition somebody to have that response whenever you want. Then we get on to operant conditioning, which is the second theory of behaviorism, and this is Albert Bandura. Remember we talked about him earlier. And so this is after the early 1900s. Now we're in the mid 1900s, right? And this kind of conditioning is a little more complicated. This kind of conditioning talks about a behavior happens as much as you reinforce it. So, behavior being a function of reinforcement there means if you reinforce it more often, the behavior will happen more often. If you decrease the reinforcement, then the behavior will happen less. All right? Punishment is the way of making the behavior decrease, right? This is making it lessen, right? So you punish a behavior, it should decrease the probability of that behavior. Okay, and there's different kinds of reinforcements, two basic kinds of reinforcements. There's positive reinforcements where you add something, like parents often give candy to their toddlers when they're potty training, so when they learn to go to the bathroom, right? So every time that they successfully go to the bathroom in the toilet, they get an M&M or a Skittle or something like that, right? That's positive reinforcement because you're adding something, right? Every time they do it. Negative reinforcement is taking something away. So that would be like grounding. That would be like taking away your Xbox. That would be like taking away your cell phone. That would be, those are negative reinforcers, right? Taking something away. Like I said, right? Parents use this kind of behaviorism all the time, right? They use positive reinforcement and they use negative reinforcement. There's different types of positive reinforcements. This is a question on the quiz. It asks you about one of these kinds of reinforcement. And I want to talk a little bit about them. One is continuous reinforcement, right? So every time that you do the behavior, you get a reward. So this is how parents start off their kids with the potty training, right? Every time they go potty, they get an M&M, let's say, right? If that's my rule in my house. I'm going to give an M&M to my kid every time he or she goes to the potty, right? Now I'm not going to do that forever, right? They're not going to be 14 and I'm going to get them an M&M when they go potty and be like, oh, good girl or good boy, you went to potty, here's your M&M, so it's not going to be forever. But continuous means that every time they exhibit the behavior, you get a reward. And that makes the behavior happen a whole lot more frequently right at the beginning, right? Because the person gets a reward every time. So then they're so solely fixed on their reward, right? So every time they do it, they get a reward. And believe me, when I did this with my kids, if I forgot to give the M&M, oh my God, it was like this big giant deal, right? So I would hear about it every time. A fixed interval means that you get rewarded every certain amount of time, right? So it could be every day, it could be every hour, it could be every minute, it could be every third time you do the behavior, that sort of thing, right? But a fixed interval means that there's an amount of time involved, right? So you can get a reward every day. So parents use this a lot with students when they first start going to school. If you had a good school day, right, you get a star or something, right? If you get 5 stars at the end of the week, then you get, to go to Yo-Craze for some frozen yogurt or something, right? So, that's kind of how fixed intervals work. Variable intervals are you're just rewarded at random times, and this is what you can do if you're a parent to kids after you've done the continuous stuff, right? You might do continuous for a while and then back off a little bit, do a fixed interval, maybe once a day, right? Hey, you went to the potty every time today in the potty, right? So that's fantastic. We'll give you, maybe a handful of M&Ms this time, right? For dessert today. And then a variable interval, you're rewarded at random times. So, the next step then is, you're not going to reward them every day for going to the potty when they're 8 years old, 9 years old, right? Maybe if they're cleaning their room all the time now, right? Since they're 8 years old, their chore is to clean their room. They're cleaning the room. Everything's looking good, right? And, every couple of weeks, I'm going to give them some sort of prize for keeping their room clean, right? One week it's going to be, say, we'll go to Dairy Queen. The next week it's, on a Thursday we're going to, go get a toy. And a couple weeks from now, you guys have been keeping up your room really great. So then, we're going to get to go out to dinner tonight. You know what I mean? So it's random kind of times, but you're still giving reinforcement. Then there's fixed ratio kinds of reinforcement, and those are rewards for every however many times, right? It could be every first like the first time you do something you get rewarded for it, right? Or it could be the every 2 times, every 10 times, every 100th time, that sort of thing. Those are fixed ratios. And fixed means that you have an amount of time passing, right? Or amount of units passing, right? And then we're going to get to the picture in the background. Do you see the gambling in the background there? We got your cards, you got your roulette wheel, you got your dice, you got your chips. Variable ratio is rewarded in no set pattern. And since it's completely random, variable ratio means random, since it's completely random, it is by far the most addictive. and the most intense. So if you want to get people addicted to something, you give variable ratio rewards. That's why people get addicted to gambling, because gambling is variable ratio. You have no idea. You might be superstitious and think you have an idea, but you really have no idea when you're going to get rewarded, when you're going to hit the big one, when you're going to, get 21, when you're going to have, a full house. You know what I mean? So mathematically, there's no pattern to it. And because there's no pattern, people think that this next time I'm going to get it, right? This next hand, I'm going to get that full house. Um, the next pull of the slot machine, right, is going to be the big one. That's why it's so addictive, is because you never know. It could be the next one. It could be, um, the thousandth time. Some of these other ones, like the fixed ratio, it's coming, right? The continuous one, every time you do it, you'll get it, right? But the variable ratio one makes it so that you never know. So it's really addictive. Okay, so let's talk about we've talked about, some experiments like the Pavlov's dogs, right? Let's talk about how a behaviorist would use this in like therapy. A behaviorist would use modeling, right? And it would be showing what is an appropriate behavior, right? And good parents do this all the time, right? They say, in this house, we don't do that, right? And they model for their kid how to behave in a certain way, right? Um, if the parent is texting on the phone while driving, right, chances are the kid later on is going to text while driving. Even if the parent says, hey, you know what, you shouldn't text while driving, the kid sees the parent do it all the time, right? And that's why models are so important as a parent, to model how to act and react to things for your kids, because your kids watch everything, and it's kind of surprising how much your kids pick up on. So, the parents out there, um, you'll notice this when they get a little older and can talk to you and stuff, but kids pick up on a surprising amount of things that you had no idea they were even paying attention to. Another thing behaviorists use is relaxation training. There's things like progressive muscle relaxation, where you tell the client to, you usually eyes closed, right? And you're telling the client, right, let's relax our shoulders, right? And usually you can see the client, like get more relaxed during the course of it. That's the goal, right? There's guided imagery, like, you're walking, your favorite place in the world, where is it? And the client would say, the beach next to the ocean. And so then the therapist would say, okay, you're walking on the beach, and you feel the sand between your toes, and you feel the water splashing up along the shore and washing over your feet, and you hear the seagulls, right, and the roar of the surf, and you smell the sea salt, right? And so that's like guided imagery. Then there's deep breathing exercises, and that's surprisingly effective. I mean, even as adults, especially when you get worked up over something, that's the first thing that behavior therapy goes to when the kids are little, is take deep breaths, because it calms you down. Breathing is really important when you get worked up. But it even works as adults too, breathing deep. See, I'm more relaxed right now, just doing that. There's exposure and aversion therapies. These are very popular. If you have a fear of flying, for instance, what you would do is you would systematically expose a person to, like, baby steps, systematically expose a person to the frightening thing until that person gets over it, right? So my example here is fear of flying, right? First, we might go and watch some planes take off and land, right? And talk about how, how much anxiety you have over that, right? And then if if that lessens a little bit and you feel a little bit better, then we'll progress on to maybe going to the airport, right? And watching the planes take off and land, watching people get on and off, watching the planes taxi up and that sort of thing, right? And then once you were comfortable with that, the next step would be maybe getting on a plane, right? Maybe not taking off, but getting on a plane and sitting on a plane for a little bit, or something that looks like a plane, because I doubt we could actually get on a plane now without Homeland Security, tasering us and taking us off to Gitmo. But so we work baby steps until you'd get actually and be comfortable getting actually on the plane. That works for all sorts of phobias, fear of animals like snakes or spiders, those sorts of things is what they're used for. A very popular thing also is reconditioning, which is basically training you to have another conditioned response, right? So you're reinforcing a different kind of behavior in order to get that behavior to happen. Okay, then the next one we need to talk about is humanistic counseling. So the second topic that we're going to discuss today is humanistic counseling. So let's talk a little bit about the history. So, well, maybe before we go on, let's end here. Okay, so we've talked about the history of behavior therapy. We've talked about what it means that to be healthy to a behaviorist, right? We've talked about conditioning and the two different kinds of conditioning. We've talked about what reinforcement is like. So all that stuff should go in that school of thought paper so that you have it when we do the big test. You're going to need it. When you're researching your therapist, you're going to need it, right? So like if you did Freud, you're going to need the psychoanalysis one. If you did Skinner, you'd need this behavior one. So, okay. All right, so now we want to do the same thing to the humanists, okay? And the humanistic counseling kind of grew out of psychoanalysis and behaviorism. So this is called the third wave of counseling in psychology. And it began in the 30s and the 40s as a response to both psychoanalysis, which had kind of peaked at this point, and it was probably as popular as it was ever going to get. And then behaviorism, which was kind of on its upward trajectory and is just starting. Now behaviorism is still around and practiced a lot. Psychoanalysis is not around very much anymore. Most people practicing now are like an amalgamation of a couple of these theories. So it's not just one thing. But humanism has had a huge impact on the field of psychology. It's person-centered, and it has a positive view of human nature. So it's a lot less, what would the word be, clinical, I guess. The behaviorists are very, I imagine them in their little white, lab coats, and they're experimenting on dogs or rats or pigeons or something. The humanists are really, really warm and positive and happy and how you think of counselors today and the school counselors and psychologists today, they're very humanistic, generally speaking. The stereotype of them is, at least. They believe this thing is underlined because you definitely want to write this down. For the humanists, I want you to remember that they believe in the therapeutic relationship. This is by far the most important thing they think. And actually, there have been quite a few studies done on the therapeutic relationship and its importance. And so they are right about this. The relationship between the therapist, whether it's a psychiatrist or psychologist or a counselor or whatever, that relationship is the most important thing. You can have any other kind of theory. As long as you have that good relationship, then the person's going to be better off. Your client will be better off. Humanistic theories generally focus on here and now, and they don't necessarily talk about your childhood. One of the drawbacks to psychoanalysis is that there's no explanation for something that currently has happened to you. The humanists focus on what's currently happening to you, and not so much in your childhood. A lot of the philosophical parts of humanistic counseling, like Gestalt and existentialism, they came out of what happened during World War II. So a lot of therapists who were Jewish, what they saw and experienced during World War II greatly affected them, obviously, and then they brought that to their therapy and their kinds of, psychological theory. So here are some major theorists. Carl Rogers is probably the most famous. He's a professor at Ohio State, the University of Chicago. He's been a professor at the University of Wisconsin. He's the founder of a theory called person-centered counseling, for which he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Pretty cool. Viktor Frankl actually lived through the Holocaust when most of his family was murdered. And so he's one of the ones that World War II greatly affected, and he founded a kind of humanistic psychology called existential psychology. I don't know if you know anything about existentialism. It's a kind of philosophy. Feel free to Google it sometime. It'll blow your mind, man. Okay, see? I'm glad I brought my drink now. Then there's Fritz and Laura Perls. They're a husband and wife team from the 40s and 50s. They actually fled the Nazis and emigrated to South Africa, and then eventually to America. Another group that was, changed by World War II. And they developed a theory called Gestalt psychology. That's how you pronounce it, Gestalt. They're German, right? So Gestalt, or Austrian, I can't remember now, but very closely aligned. And the humanistic school of thought, let's compare this to the behaviorism. Humanistic school of thought had, for human nature, they believed that people were inherently good and that they want to be self-actualized, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's basically, becoming the best person you can be. They believe that people are more than the sum of their parts, which means that there's something that can't quite be quantified or studied inside a person that makes them who they are. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's not something that a behaviorist can, figure out. It's something that is innately human. And they believe that people are goal-oriented, which means that they're focused on goals, right? And whether or not they reach those goals has a lot to do with how they view themselves. Do you remember Adler in the psychoanalysis school of thought? He believed that, people, aside from birth order, he believed that people were really interested in whether or not they achieve their goals in life, right? So these guys really focus on that. And ladies. They believe that a healthy person is healthy when the person can be aware of, how they react to things, how they behave, how they think, how they feel, and when they believe that they are, at least in the process of becoming their best self. And they believe that problems come from a lack of this kind of awareness, right? They believe that people just aren't aware of, what they're doing to harm themselves. That's what they believe. Let's talk about Carl Rogers first. He was the first person to emphasize both thoughts and feelings. And so, even though he's humanistic, we're getting kind of into the cognitive realm, which we'll talk about next week, but which means thoughts. And Rogers really believed that your thoughts and your feelings were connected together, and were really important to talk about them both together as a group of things. And this is a quote from him, he said that people will move toward health if the way is open to them. So the purpose of the psychology then is to make sure that path is open, right? So if you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a counselor, your job then is to make sure that they know where they're going and have a path to get there, right? That's your job as a therapist. He believed in that people had two selves, a real self and a false self. The real self was something that's positive, the self-concept that's positive about yourself. So, all the things inside you that you believe are good and positive about yourself. And, understanding that false self, understanding that real self, that's the key to things for Rogers and for person-centered counselors and for person-centered psychologists. A false self is something that you experience in reality, and it's the self that you project to others, kind of like where Jung was talking about how we have masks. Rogers kind of picked up on that idea, and he talked a lot about how you need acceptance from people in order to feel like you are your best self. Does that make sense to people? You have to belong to something, he would say. Most people have to, have a sense that other people like them and enjoy their company and stuff, right? And he would say that once you integrate the real and the false together, once you get that mask perfectly aligning with yourself, with your real self, your real self and your mask kind of line up together, he would say that is what he would call self-actualization, where you're supposed to get. So he would say healthy people have self-actualization. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is Viktor Frankl. Um, this is a quote from him from a book that he wrote, his first book about um, his psychological theory, existential psychology, and he was a survivor of 3 concentration camps, if you can believe that. He went to 3 of them. Most of his family died, he survived. And so he wrote, "A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love." Which I find kind of remarkable, it's amazing that he could say something like, the salvation of people is through love. After what he had seen and what the Nazis had done to his family and, to 3 million Jews, that's amazing to me. He was an amazing guy, though. So yeah, I know one person was researching him, and he's a real interesting story. So existentialism focuses on questions of existence. That's where they get the word existentialism, right? It's existence. And what I found is that teenagers kind of like existentialism because it focuses on some big questions that you're answering usually in your teenage years. You have questions about why you're here, about what your purpose is, about what it means to have a meaningful life. Teenagers a lot of times are preoccupied by 4 major things: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Freedom, you're trying to rebel against your parents. Death, obviously, something that all people think about, really. A lot of people try and repress and not deal with it, because death can be scary and, you're losing someone and that sort of thing. Isolation, of course, has to do with peer groups and peer pressure and, whether or not you fit in or not fit in and all that sort of thing, right? And meaninglessness, a lot of students all the time are like, man, this is just busy work and I'm not learning anything and this doesn't have anything to do with me and stuff, right? But what a lot of people maybe don't realize in the moment is that you may not see a meaning for it right now, but there's a reason why you're being taught this thing. There's a reason why it's there in the first place. You may not be able to see it now, but there's a reason why it's there. Viktor Frankl talked a lot about anxiety. And he actually thought that a certain amount of anxiety can be good and useful. You have to be anxious in order, he would say, in order to be creative, in order to change, in order to do your best work. So all you procrastinators out there know this to be true, right? When you start feeling anxious that there's a due date coming up, right? That's when you do your best work. So he says, a certain amount of anxiety can be good. He has a couple of German words that he uses. One is Umwelt, Mitwelt, and Eigenwelt. Pretty good German, right? I know. Umwelt means the world around. So it's the natural world. It's your biological desires and drives, right? So it's the id. That like he puts the id in this category, right? And he also believes that the natural world, that the biological world around you is the Umwelt, the world around, right? The Mitwelt is the with world, right? So those are the fellow humans that are with you. So this is your friends, your family, your peer group, your classmates, your teachers, your bosses, who else would be in your life? Random passersby you meet on the street or on the bus, right? Those sorts of things. That's the with world. Eigenwelt means own world. That's the relationship that you have with yourself. So those are all the internal thoughts and feelings and desires and goals and all those sorts of things you have with yourself. That's the Eigenwelt, the own world. And the goal is to find your meaning in the world, right? An existentialist would say that everybody who's healthy has found his or her meaning in the world. They understand, the person understands what he or she is there, what he or she is there for, and can tailor their existence around that one idea, right? I'm here to teach you psychology, right? I'm here to be a counselor. I am here to, be a good parent to my kids, right? All those things are meaningful to me. So, now Fritz and Laura Perls, right? They came up with Gestalt therapy. I can't even say it. Gestalt therapy, another German word for it. And they were working in the 40s and the 50s. So right after World War II was over with, they went to South Africa, and eventually they came to America. And Gestalt is a German word that means unified or whole. And so, that's where the idea of, treating the whole person comes from. Not just their behaviors, like a behaviorist would do. You're not just going to treat the childhood of a person or get over their issues from their childhood like a psychoanalyst would. You're going to treat the whole person. And this kind of therapy focuses on the client's personal responsibility, that you can actually change something. So it's really empowering for somebody, who's going through a therapist in Gestalt therapy, because you have the power to change your circumstances. In psychoanalysis, that's less true, right? Because you were affected greatly by this thing that happened in your past. And in behaviorism, you have to, figure out a different way of, exhibiting socially appropriate behavior. So Gestalt therapy is nice in that you have your own personal responsibility. And it's focused on the present, this exact moment, on the sensations that happen in this moment, what you're feeling in this moment, how you behave in this moment. So it's focused on the here and now, what's happening right now. And so it de-emphasizes the past and it de-emphasizes the future. So it's concerned about what you're doing right now and how you're going to feel, right now or a minute from now. So it focuses on the present environment and then how that reacts with the client. And Gestalt therapy, kind of like Carl Rogers, right? His was self-actualization. That's the goal. It's very similar with Gestalt therapy. Ooh, went too far. What Gestalt therapy is, right? It's becoming self-aware. And you're aware of how you're feeling, how you're thinking, how you're behaving in this particular moment. And why that's happening. That's self-awareness, they would say. And so what does therapy look like to a humanist? All the humanists have a couple things in common, right? They believe that it's two people sitting in chairs facing each other, talking about their current events, their current feelings, their current thoughts. They also believe that the therapeutic relationship is the most important. That, inside the room, that it's a safe place. So, counselors believe this, school counselors believe this, right? That you have to have this safe place. Like my office is a place you can come in and you could tell me anything. Now, I might have to say something, if you're going to harm yourself or others and that sort of thing, but if you've encountered abuse in the past, but for the most part, you can talk about whatever you want. And, a lot of people do. And they have this thing that they call unconditional positive regard. So if you remember anything from the humanists, remember this word, remember this phrase, these three words, because this summarizes exactly what a humanist is. A humanist exhibits unconditional positive regard. Unconditional, like unconditional love, right? It doesn't matter what the client did at all. And it's positive, right? It doesn't matter what the client did because I'm going to think of you in a positive way all the time. I always have the idea that you're trying your best, that you're doing your best, Now, for a lot of psychologists, that's hard to do when you're talking about domestic violence or when you're talking about, some, horrible crime that's happened in the past to this person. But, if the therapist really believes this, if the psychologist really believes this, this unconditional positive regard thing, then the place becomes really safe, right? Then the client can talk to you about anything because you're always going to, be on that person's, you're always going to, be non-judgmental about it. Person-centered is slightly different because they talk about immediacy a lot, which is it's a therapeutic term, so psychologists know this, counselors know this term, and it's calling out what's unsaid. So, if you are if you're pretend you're the psychologist, right? And you're seeing me as a client, right? And I'm like this, right? And I'm talking like this the whole time, and I won't look at you or talk to you at all, or I mean, look at you in the face when I'm talking to you. Then I might, as a um, kind of tool, a therapeutic tool, I might use immediacy. I might say, I noticed that you never look at me. Is it because, I'm a male and you're a female? Is that the reason why? Did something happen recently, that makes that happen? Or, I would ask, I would call it out, and I would say, I noticed that you never look at me in the eyes, that you always talk down, but I've noticed that to other people, you look them in the eyes and you talk to them right to their face. And then you let the client kind of go with that, right? Gestalt therapy is really interested in experimenting, in new ways of thinking and feeling. Since they want you to become self-aware, they want you to try new things, right? So they want you to get out there and do new things. So they do a lot of, in therapy, they do a lot of things like, okay, let's pretend that you're not afraid of heights. What would that be like? Or they would say things like, well, let's pretend that you could look inside the head of another person, your mom, right? What is she thinking about you? That sort of stuff. Existential therapists, they're concerned about balancing spiritual, philosophical kinds of perspectives with reality. And that's where they think the meaning is. And so here's what it looks like, two people sitting in a room, talking. You can see the therapist is sitting forward, right? Interested in what the client has to say. The client should get the sense that the person is, fully attuned and thinking about what exactly he's saying, and that the person is not going to judge him for whatever he says in therapy. We made it. That was a long time, I know. And it was 2 theories put together in one. So, hopefully you got both schools of thought papers done, right? So remember that, if you watch this all the way through and you didn't get anything, you have it's recorded. So just go back and rewind a little bit, or pause it and then take a note and then continue on, and then pause it and, write something down and continue on, right? And that's what you want to do. All right? So good luck on the quiz, and, let me know how it goes. All right? When you have questions about either of these therapies, or either of these theories, I said theories, send me an email, send me a text, call me up, see me in class, whatever you want to do, okay? And I can help you out, and we can talk about it. All right? All right, guys. Have a good week.